Right. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. So for this afternoon, exceptionally, we have a very special talk by our own Marie-Carmen Bagnol, who has very nicely accepted to give a special seminar. So since this is a special talk, I have a few words to introduce her. So Marie-Carmen is, as you know, an internationally recognized expert in tensor network techniques for body problems. So she got her PhD, first PhD from Valencia in particle phenomenology, and then a second PhD from the same place in computer science. Soon after, she joined Ignacio Sirac's group at the Max Planck Institute in Munich, and now she's admitted herself at the same institute. And what I didn't know is that in 2015, she was awarded the Spanish Award of Civil Merit, which was awarded by the King of Spain. So we are very happy that she has accepted to talk about tensor networks and the simulation of out of equilibrium, so we meant by the dynamics. So
well, thank you very much for the very nice introduction, and thanks to the two organizers for the opportunity of giving a talk here, and thanks to all of you for coming to the workshop, making it such a great event, and for coming to this talk. And my apologies to the experts in tensor networks. This is not a very technical tensor network talk, and I know there are real experts in the audience. But I wanted to also give a talk in the spirit of the workshop to motivate interactions, and then my plan is not to give a lot of details about or a very say thorough review of what you can do with tensor networks. We've had very nice talks already, and we will have some more. But rather telling you about some lines of thought, lines of research that we are following in the last few years to try to push these tensor network methods in the direction of doing things for dynamics. And so it will have several parts, and I will tell you about these ideas without many details, because I think maybe this triggers some interest and possibilities to discuss about other problems, other fields where these ideas could be applied or could be useful, or we could learn also something how to do things better. So this is all work done mostly in the field division of the Max Planck Institute for Quantum Optics. Some of it also in collaboration with Luca Tagliacozzo, who is in Madrid in the CSIC. And well, I won't talk about all these papers, but there are a number of references. So I'm not giving a comprehensive introduction about tensor networks because there's been already some talks, very nice talks by Ross and Thomas last week. There will be more talks by you two and Ash this week. I'm sorry I didn't add your name because I just spoke out from the top of my head. But just for like say. So to put us all on the same ground, what tensor networks are a way to describe quantum many-body systems states efficiently. And the idea is that if you want to write an arbitrary quantum many-body state, we've heard already a lot about these states even today, you need to specify in principle the state in a given basis, and this grows exponentially with the size of the number of constituents of your system. So you could give all the components of this vector, and you will have a perfect description of the state. And in tensor network pictures, that will be a box with n legs, with every leg representing one of the indices of your individual constituents in the system. So this is for us an n-rank tensor. And this, of course, has exponential cost in a number of constituents. The idea of tensor networks is that instead of these general coefficients, one thinks of families where coefficients can be written in terms of smaller tensors. So these are smaller blocks with a certain number of legs connected in a certain way. Connections between the tensors represent like a matrix contraction, a multiplication over a common index. But what it means is that there's a restriction. So from the exponentially large Hilbert space, we restrict ourselves to a polynomially large family where it can be parameterized in terms of some smaller tensors. And this is a tensor network state. And we know, and we heard in the talks by yours and Thomas, why this is our Landsat for ground state and thermal equilibrium states, and basically this is related to the entanglement properties of these physical states that we want to describe. There is an area law of entanglement. We also have an idea of an organization of entanglement in larger and larger tensor networks, and how the ones that are more difficult to describe are the ones that can hold more entanglement. And we have efficient numerical algorithms to compute these ground states and thermal equilibrium states. And we heard about the, say, paradigmatic tensor network families, the matrix product state in the talk by Urs, and what I will be talking about will be mainly our matrix product states. And that is a particular case of these tensor network families where the coefficients have the structure that is shown in this picture. So basically, we have a product of individual tensors, one per site in our system, and they are connected with two neighbors, such that if you fix one of the physical indices of these open coefficients, you have basically a product of matrices, and hence the name. So one very important property of matrix product states is that if you have a state described with these ansatz, and you compute what is the entropy of half the change, so the entanglement entropy of half of the system with respect to the other, this is upper bounded by how big these tensors are. So it's upper bounded by the logarithm of the one dimension, which is this dimension of the matrices. And this is a very important property. Matrix product states satisfy an area law because this doesn't depend on how big your system is. It only depends on how big your matrices are. But it's also a limitation if you want to describe states that have a lot of entanglement, because it tells you that you will need a lot of one dimension, growing exponentially with how much entropy you want to describe. So I already mentioned that we have these efficient numerical algorithms, and this is actually based on very good theoretical understanding of the mathematical properties of these families, and this is related actually to this area law property that I was saying before in the case of ground states and thermal equilibrium states. This is just a repetition. This means that in practice we can apply them for a lot of interesting problems. And this is just an example, because if you don't show some graphs, it doesn't seem like you apply them for something, right? So some numerics. This is an example of a lattice gauge theory, because we've been talking about that also. So Pep's calculation, this is not matrix product states, this is a result from a Pep's calculation. But just as an example, that they can be used, for instance, for ground states that appear in lattice gauge theories. So there's many results in this direction. There's some reviews in there if somebody's interested in this particular application. But this is not what I'm talking about today, because beyond ground states and low energy eigenstates and say thermal equilibrium states, which are all very important for the physical properties of the systems of the states, there are also other physically relevant states, and those are the ones that appear, for instance, after out of equilibrium dynamics. In the course of out of equilibrium dynamics, we also want to understand out of equilibrium. So, for instance, after a quantum quench, or we would like sometimes to understand what happens at high energy densities. But high energy eigenstates and these states that appear after or during time evolution do not satisfy, in general, this area law of entanglement. On the contrary, they have a volume law. They have as much entanglement as they have, basically. And that means that all these arguments, while in tensor networks, in the one-dimensional case, matrix product states, are good ansatz, do not hold. And yet, we would like to use our numerical tools to learn about these problems, because they are physically very relevant. So my talk is about this, how to develop new tools that use the power of tensor network techniques to learn something about these regimes that escape the most standard, say, algorithms. So the standard, say, knowledge about using tensor networks, in particular for the one-dimensional case, matrix product states for out of equilibrium, tells us that because entanglement grows, this limits what we can do with matrix product states. And that's true, but we are still interested in this question. And one reason that we are interested in it is because it holds very fundamental questions. For instance, it holds the key to things like thermalization of closed quantum systems. Like how does actually a thermal bath appear? So how does a quantum system accept this description? Or whether the eigenstate thermalization hypothesis that is the theoretical framework to explain thermalization in quantum systems, whether it holds or not for a given model, for a given Hamiltonian. So all these things are not cannot be solved, say, with analytical methods in the most empirical situation, but our numerical tools are sort of limited. So we are interested in pushing this limit. So what is the deal with real-time evolution and say tensor networks, and in particular matrix product states? Because this thing, even in 1D, is still hard to do. While for 1D, we were hearing also in previous talks last week that ground states and thermal equilibrium states and so on, this is done, so we know how to do it. Out of equilibrium is still hard. So what is the deal? Well, there are different algorithms to simulate real-time evolution with matrix product states. The classical ones would be like TDD or time-dependent EMRG. There are also time-dependent variational principle, which Yuto and co-workers introduced some years ago. But they have something in common, which is that the time-evolved state is approximated matrix product state. So I wanted to sketch here how like the classical algorithms work, but this is not so important for this statement. So it is true for all these algorithms that at the end you have a description of the evolved state as a matrix product state, but you try to have that. So in these more standard algorithms, how the algorithm works is you want to apply the evolution operator, you discretize the times doing some kind of trautherization, and for each of these steps, you basically approximate the effect of that little step of time on your state, and you approximate that again as with a state with the same answer as a matrix product state. But typically, this requires a triangulation of the size of your matrices, because otherwise you could just pile up your matrices on top of each other, multiply the dimensions, and that would be exact, but of course it would grow exponentially with the number of time steps you do. So in practice, what you do is every step you approximate the result again with a matrix product state, and then it has an upper bounded entropy. So the problem comes here, because we know that in this time evolution, entanglement may grow. It may grow linearly with time. And when this happens, that means that your bond dimension needs to grow exponentially with time. So this is really the problem, or the problematic situation. And again, the paradigmatic setup to study these questions is that of a global quench. In one dimension, the picture, the cartoon picture, would be the one that I'm showing here. So at the initial time, we could start in an uncorrelated state, which is a product state. This can be written exactly as a matrix product state or any tensor network, because there's no correlation. And this is at time zero. In the generic situation, when we let it evolve with some interacting Hamiltonian or some generic Hamiltonian, there's no conservation of anything except for energy. And we wait for a long time, we expect that local observables are well described by a thermal ensemble, because we expect local observables to thermalize. That means that their expectation value will be very close, most of the time, to some expectation value, which would be the one in a statistical ensemble compatible to whatever we had at the beginning, which is only the energy density. There's nothing more conserved. So that would be a thermal ensemble. And we might have some few conserved quantities, but still, if this is the expected situation, then we know that these kind of states can also be well approximated by a tensor network and such. Now there is a difference here, of course. The initial tensor network is a pure state, and the final one is a mixed state, because it's only good to describe local observables. It's not the full state of the system, but it's good enough to give us the physical information that we will get in an experiment measuring the local observables. Okay, so that's the setup. And the situation, as I said, is that in time, entropy may grow linearly. So we can have a zero entropy at the beginning, it grows linearly with time. So the one dimension we need to describe this thing with some fixed precision as a matrix product state will grow exponentially. This is, of course, a cartoon picture, but this is sort of telling you how our requirements go in time. And this is what people call the entanglement barrier. For a short time, thing is fine. You can work with whatever computer capabilities you have and describe your state with some given precision, but after some time, you don't have enough capability to keep on with this precision. It grows exponentially, so there's no way to keep on for arbitrarily long times. So this is somehow the challenge and the puzzle that we know at the end we should be able to describe this thing efficiently with our transform network tools, at least to some extent, local observables and so on. And at the beginning, we know what it is, and we can simulate the dynamics for a little while with these algorithms that I was mentioning. But we would like to go around this limitation and get to understand the whole problem, at least in some cases. And well, there's a lot of effort going on in this direction. There's been a number of algorithms proposed in the last years, and I want to tell you about a few lines of research in which one can try to approach the problem and maybe hopefully make some progress in this direction. So really the thing we want to do is to access long time dynamics. Oh, by the way, I didn't say, but please feel free to interrupt me at any moment and ask. Yeah. And this is too slow. Okay. Of course, I gave you a strong argument why we cannot follow the full evolution from the beginning to the end because of this growth of entanglement, right? So this is basically a no-go with matrix description if the entanglement is wrong. So the solution has to be giving up the full tensor network description and just concentrating on something that we can compute. And somehow common line of thought in some of the approaches I'm going to describe is that thinking of entanglement in a bit of a more broad sense can help sometimes. You will see in a second what I mean. So as I said, the thing in common of the approaches I want to describe is that we are not trying to describe the full state as a time-dependent ansatz, but we are concentrating in different aspects. So I want to describe three lines of work, basically in chronological order. And this, you will see, one of them is computing local observables, so focusing only on local observables, but trying to follow sort of the standard procedure of following the evolution from the very beginning. But then we can also take a different perspective and try to look at properties of the full Hamiltonian, the quantum many-body Hamiltonian, beyond what we typically look at, like the ground state and thermal equilibrium states. And finally, what I think is also a new take on the entanglement and how it behaves in dynamics is how we really get to this mixed state description from the pure state description by identifying long-range entanglement and transforming it into mixed state. So let me start with the first one. I will not be technical and I will just pass some slides fast because I don't want to describe all the details. But I'm very happy to discuss details of these things in detail if any of you is interested. I just would like to give you the ideas now that guide this line of thought. So okay, the first idea is rather on that side of the entanglement barrier. So what we are trying to do is to push it to the right, so trying to follow the evolution to longer and longer times for local observables. And the idea is that instead of using the tensor network as an ansatz for the state, we use tensor networks to describe the observable itself. And what you see in here is a picture that you could think is similar to a path integral picture. But now it's not in Euclidean time, there is real time in here. So what it means is you have your initial state in here, which is an MPS, and then you start doing evolution. So it's not Euclidean time, it's real time evolution. But this is really the evolution operator sort of discretized in time as I described before. And what you have above is the adjoint of that thing. So if you want to compute an observable, you contract the state with the adjoint and you sandwich in between some observable. So this tensor network will be a picture of what an expectation value of a local observable looks like. It's a tensor network. There is nothing open, so there are open legs here because I imagine this to be infinite already in the thermodynamic theory. But this is really a number. There is no open legs. But it's a tensor network. The problem is contracting it. So basically, that's the idea. So the tensor network now is an observable. The problem is finding a good approximation to this contraction. And if we are in a translational invariant system, there are basically two objects here. One is this transfer operator, which is the pink column that is repeated infinitely many times, and the other one is very similar but has the observable operator in between. You can have, of course, several of these. And now the problem reduces to contracting these semi-infinite parts of the network and then finalizing the contraction with this different column in between. So this thing now on the right or on the left, now they are tensor networks too, which have a number of open legs. So they are vectors in this highly dimensional space. So if I can find the fixed point of this transfer operator on the right and on the left, I could just rewrite this as a vector, which is like a full many-body object. So I don't know what this is, but I could finish this contraction. So the trick is to try to do this with tensor network tools. So I would like to approximate that with tensor networks. This, as such, doesn't work either. But we can get some intuition of why it doesn't work, what the problem is, by thinking of about the quasi-particle model. So the quasi-particle picture is really the scenario where we understand best how the entanglement behaves in the out of equilibrium dynamics in the one-dimensional case. So what you would have in this scenario is you start in a state which is uncorrelated, but you don't have an equilibrium state. You have a state with some finite energy density, and this finite energy density corresponds to injecting pairs of quasi-particles that do not interact with each other in the simplest situation, but they will travel apart. So you have some momentum k and minus k, and they just travel apart from each other. And because they are correlated, the pair, they extend these correlations in your system in time. That's what these arrows representing here. So this would be the range of your correlations created by these pairs of quasi-particles. So because in this tensor network, you have the same thing in the Ket and in the Bra, these correlations will be reflected in the Ket and in the Bra. And if you would look at the picture transversely, you would have correlations that appear between sites that are, say, at the same time in the Ket and in the Bra, because you have the same thing in both halves of the network. So this would make the contraction also not work. I'm not getting into the details, but it tells us that because these sites are correlated, if we put them together, we will reduce these correlations. We will be just having a single site for both the site above and the site below, and we call this folding the network. So we just take the tensor network, fold it into, put together these two sites. Now it's the same network, it's only like origami with tensor networks, right? So you are looking at the same thing from the side, but now this is a single tensor with double legs. So if you just explore what happens, so try to see what happens here, you see that doing this actually reduces the entanglement in this transverse contraction. If you now try to find this fixed point I was talking about before. I just want to say it, not to enter into the details, but this was an old plot, but there's been a lot of work trying to understand what is this. Now this is called temporal entanglement in this network, and when it is growing slower than the space entanglement and making this contraction more efficient. But you can also think of that as a practical tool to try to reach longer times in particular problems, as I will say in a moment. But anyway, there are very recent papers also understanding these vectors, these say boundary vectors, as influence functionals, because they really represent the effect of the rest of the system in your say single site if you are just looking at a local observer. So this is all very interesting. I'm not talking a lot about that. I just want to go one step beyond and say, okay, what can we do with tensor networks in here? Well, it turns out that if you have a local Hamiltonian, this is not all you have. So this folding is not all the tricks you have at hand, because your Hamiltonian is local. These unitaries will have sort of this local structure. Maybe it's easier to think of a quantum circuit, which has some brick wall structure. So you have this folding. What you are doing is tracing out indices, say in this side. So every time you have this here, you have a unitary connected with its set, basically. So local terms will cancel out, and you will have a light cone. It's a trivial light cone. It's not the physical light cone. It's really the tensor network light cone. But is this exact? Yes. Okay. Okay. I thought that was a question. Okay. So what this tells us is that the structure of these fixed vectors that we were looking for is fixed. Is this kind of triangles in the tensor network, and we can use tensor network tools to try to find them in the most efficient possible way, and this gives us a more efficient and systematic way of approaching the problem in this transverse direction. And well, this is just some example how this works for a non-integrable case. I'm not gonna tell you all the details, but somehow if you do the standard, so this is sort of conservation of energy, which you expect to happen, and it's a sign that something's going wrong in your algorithm. So this is how it breaks if you do the standard algorithm, ITV. And this is how it works with basically the same computational effort if you do this tricks that I was describing. So basically you are pushing somehow the entanglement barrier to the right, but you are not pushing it to infinity. I don't want to give this impression because that's not true. Just want to mention that these kind of tricks work also for other quantities. And for instance, one can compute response functions, so thermal response functions with this trick. And then it turns out to be quite nice, quite funny. Because if you have and I said before, passing, that you have an efficient description of your thermal state as a tensor network. So you can write this as a purification, which would be this picture here. So this picture here, that would be a thermal state. I'm not telling you the details about how you find this, but there is a good approximation of a thermal state like that for local Hamiltonians. So you can do the same thing. You can now write a tensor network for say 2-time correlator, like the one I'm writing in here, which is what you need to compute a lot of response functions, right? So you can just insert one operator at time 0, evolve, and insert another operator. So this would be exactly the kind of structure your tensor network has, but now it's naturally folded if you want, because these things are connected. The one above and below, there is a base. And if you fold it in the same way as before, we find a tensor network which is very, very similar to the one I was drawing before, and still has the Lycon structure. But it's even more interesting because, say,
Can I ask a question?
Yes, of course.
Yeah. Does this work also for auto-thermal correlation functions, basically with more points?
There is a different structure. I mean, you could do it, and we can talk later. Then you get you could do it, but it's much more complicated. Mm-hmm. So it's not this simple tensor network, and it's not clear if you gain anything or not. But you can draw the tensor network.
Can you be more specific about what happened in the folding?
Sorry?
Can you be more specific about what happened in the folding?
In the folding? In this case, you mean?
Yeah.
Okay, so you start with, okay. So you start with a thermal state which has this structure. This is the purification or thermophile double thermal state. So in here, I just put one half of the state here and one half of the state there, because then it looks very similar to what I had before with my pure state. Before I didn't have these indices, now I have the purification indices joining the thing above and below. So in the folding, I'm just folding across this line, and then this half of the state is coming together with the other half. So now I have all my thermal state here. So, and the rest of the network, the thing above is exactly as it was before. The only thing that changed actually is the initial state, which is not this thermal state, and I have this insertion of the state here. But now the thermal state is an equilibrium state for this Hamiltonian. So it shouldn't evolve, right? There should be a Lycon also below. So that Lycon is now not exact because we have an approximation to the thermal state and a totalization. It's a bit of the detail, but in infinite temperature it is exact. So which means that this tensor network now reduces to this, say, pillow form. This for same position observables, but you can do the same thing for observables at different positions. And then you have this set of tensor networks that you can contract. And in principle, you can compute response functions with that. And as an example, we use it to compute the diffusion constant in this non-integrable Ising chain. And you can show that you can go farther than with other. But again, I don't want to stop very much on the details of the numerics, but I'm happy to discuss this part. Just the idea. Okay, one can contract things in non-standard way, and there is a lot of interesting results lately about how entanglement grows in this transverse direction, which I think is also very a field on its own. Yes.
If you use the traditional ITVE,
yes.
How far can you go in that plot?
So in this plot, actually, the blue points are what you get with ITVE. with the same one dimension. So this you need to extrapolate to infinite time. And you see that already here, the thing is deviating, right? So it doesn't seem like a very big difference, but of course you want to extrapolate this state, so you need some kind of stable state. In this case, you cannot extrapolate beyond that because it's not monotonically heavy. So, okay. Yeah, that was all the pushing the entanglement barrier to that side, but the other tools that I want to tell you about are rather well, okay. In a way, looking on the other side directly, because it's really looking at properties of the full many-body Hamiltonian, not really about following the evolution. And the idea is looking at the spectral properties of the Hamiltonian. What I mean with this is, imagine that you have a local Hamiltonian, then it has some density of states, but basically looks Gaussian when you go into a large system. And actually, the width goes like the square root of the number of particles in the system. So when you go to larger and larger systems, this in energy density becomes a very narrow peak. In this region, what is easy to do is the highest point of this density of states, where at infinite temperature, basically, where everything is Gaussian, and you can use Gaussian approximation for this, and everything works, but it only works for 1 over the square root of n energy density. And the edges, where you basically have a good tensor network approximation, like typically for the ground state or the state on the other side, maybe a few excitations. But if you want to know things in the middle or in the tails of this Gaussian, that's hard. So our tensor networks cannot really approximate one state there in the middle. And yeah, if you want the microcanonical ensemble, for instance, you will need to construct some operator like that, a delta of the energy for this Hamiltonian. So instead of that, what we are going to do is to broaden this and construct a Gaussian filter that gives us something at the energy density that we want. And what you can get from there are what we call generalized densities of states, because basically you can compute functions which are averaging. So we are not just getting one state. Oh, sorry, yes.
Just one question to the previous figure.
Yes.
So on the left, way before the peak is physical. Everything else is basically because we have a finite model space or something like that.
A finite? Sorry?
Oh, I misunderstand this figure, I'm afraid. So this is the density of states.
Yes.
But then I would say only way below the peak is physical. That's the ground state region and low line. And then of course, tensor take increases exponentially. But already everything at the peak and right from there is just wrong.
I mean, you don't want negative temperatures, but you can think of you can think of systems with like finite dimensional Hilbert spaces, right? Like local Hilbert spaces where infinite so negative temperature makes sense because it's like an inversion, it's like a highly excited state, but it doesn't really matter for this argument. Like I draw the picture here, but I could have put it there. So it's that's really not relevant for what I'm saying. So if you have a system where you're only interested in positive temperatures, that's still okay. What I'm saying still works. It's just, I don't know, I put the picture this way. So yeah, my argument why we should be interested in anything like that is that what we are getting is not a single eigenstate, it's an ensemble of many eigenstates which are close in energy. So what you can compute with that are averages of observables, for instance, under this kind of filter, and this would convert to microcanonical averages, so we could extract microcanonical properties. But if your observable that you put in there is really the identity, then it's really the density of states that gives you access to, say, thermodynamic properties also. And if instead of that local observable, you would consider a projector on a given initial state, then what you get is what people call local density of states, or really the spectral distribution of a given initial state. And this is just another way of accessing the survival probability that Lea was talking about last week. That is really a dynamical property. Gives you like what is the probability to get back the initial state later in evolution. So it contains really information about the evolution of the full state on local action. Okay, so what can we do to get that?
Can I ask? What you just said, basically, it's the time average of the Loschmidt-Echo, right?
The
Time, infinite time average of for the Loschmidt-Echo.
it would be the same as the locksmith echo,
It's
the
the
survival
purity
probability.
of the deface state.
The survival probability would be basically the locksmith echo, and this thing would be a Fourier transform.
Right.
What I was talking about.
Yeah.
So if we want to prepare this kind of ensemble, what that I call a filter state, I don't know why. So okay, hope you.
Well, yeah,
It
just
says
need-
preparing a filter
Can you
state.
just click it?
I
Okay.
don't know. Okay, yes, I did. Yeah, sorry. Sorry, I didn't see my cursor. Okay, so how can we prepare this kind of thing? So we could think of an initial state which has an energy distribution. And this is this kind of histogram, this like map of the density of states, and we could put a filter on top to try to narrow it. But we know that if we do this and try to construct this state, in general, the entanglement of this thing grows. Not nicely with the width of the filter. So the entropy grows as the inverse filter width. So the narrower we want to make it, the more entropy we need. And if we want to simulate this with tensor networks, which is what I'm going to try to do, then of course that becomes non-efficient. So there's only some widths that we can simulate. Yeah, this is the half chain entropy. Yeah. But I think it's also true. Yeah, no, yes, not the half chain, but the subsystem entropy. Yes. Okay, so the other possibility is to try to compute properties of this kind of state of ensemble, and this gives us access to these quantities that I was saying before. And this is this line of work that we call filter algorithms, which basically can be filtering a state, which is the same picture I showed before. So thinking of as an initial state, given initial state, putting the energy filter on top, which means killing somehow the components that are away from the desired energy. And if you do that, you can see easily that the expectation value of observables in this filtered state will converge to microcanonical properties. And if you just look at the norm, basically, or the probability of this filter in this filtered state, so the expectation value of this operator in this state, this gives you basically how much weight the initial state had in this energy window, say, natural. So that would be the energy distribution of the local nested states. And this could be done with a quantum algorithm, but we can also think of the filter as an ensemble itself. And I think this is more interesting, at least from the point of view, and more efficient from the point of view of the simulation. So the idea is that we can think of this filter as a diagonal operator in the energy eigenbasis. And then we can think of it as an ensemble, which is diagonal in the energy eigenbasis. We only need to normalize it. And well, if the energy field, if the filter goes to infinitesimally narrow width, then this thing converges to the microcanonical ensemble itself. So the expectation values will be expectation values of the in the macrocanonical ensemble. And the trace factor, which will be the trace of this operator, is actually the density of states, or will converge to the density of states. The interesting thing connecting this to dynamics is that this is equivalent to what we would get as a diagonal ensemble after evolving an initial product state. Because, say, a product state has an energy distribution which is typically Gaussian in these local Hamiltonians, and the diagonal ensemble is really what describes the time average properties after a long time evolution. So basically what it does is decohere the different energy contributions, so the contribution from the different energy eigenstates. In this thing here, you don't have any coherences from the very beginning. So if you can prepare this thing, it would sort of be equivalent to exploring the microcanonical properties, say, with this diagonal ensemble without the need to do this long-time evolution. Now, how we do this, I'm just skipping this. Basically, the only idea is that we write the Gaussian filter as a Fourier series, sort of, as a sum of time evolutions. And these time evolutions, you only need to go to times that go as the inverse width of your filter. In terms of quantum device, which could simulate this thing, this means you can do efficiently this approximation to the microcanonical, but you can also do it with tensor networks and call this a quantum-inspired classical simulation. So with this quantum inspired. I'm just going a bit fast because I want to show you the last part of the talk, and I'm already talking for very long. But so with this quantum inspired, it's interesting that you can now try to probe the eigenstate thermalization hypothesis, which is really challenging to do, except with exact analyzation, but exact analyzation is limited to finite, so small systems, right? So we want to see the properties of so what the eigenstate thermalization hypothesis gives you is an ansatz for the matrix elements of physical observables in the energy eigenbasis. So if a system fulfills ETH, then matrix elements of physical observables have a certain form. They have a diagonal part that is really the microcanonical value, and they have a off-diagonal part that decays very fast and so on. So you can do tests of that by exact analyzation, probing how the matrix elements of certain observables are. But for large systems, you cannot do exact analysis. So in this way, you can do sort of an average of matrix elements that gives you access to these things. And you can test the diagonal part. And in here, this is an example where we really did this for a generic spin chain. What you see here is almost the whole energy range of the full Hamiltonian. So not the edges, but the middle part. And the different points show how the values that we obtain from this estimation of the microcanonical with narrower and narrower filters converts to the, in this case, thermal values, which we expect in this case to be the same. And here you have systems up to 80 sites, for which, of course, exact analysis is not possible at all. I have some details about how we did this and how it converges with the width, but I'm not stopping here. It's even more challenging to go to the diagonal part, because then you have this ansatz, you have this structure function that you want to probe, and this is related to two time correlators, not only to one expectation value, say. And it's because, well, this is basically, you can access these properties by looking at some structure functions, which you obtain from a Fourier transform of a two-time correlator. And again, this thing is difficult to compute exactly, but you have now two elements here. You have a certain state which is diagonal in the energy basis, which have a filter ensemble for this, but you have also a fixed value of energy differences between the matrix elements you want to analyze. But what we can do is, instead of fixing this, to relax this energy difference and use a filter here. So a second filter. So we now combine two filters and we can access precisely this region in there, which is averaging over many of the diagonal matrix elements, weighted with some density of states factor, which we could access with our previous method, or with some, in some cases, with some tricks we can do that. So I'm gonna jump over the details of the test. We looked at a chain that now contains different terms so that we can tune it from integrable to non-integrable to, say, localized, and explore how this function has different dependence on the energy difference. It's actually very different. It scales very differently in the integrable and non-integrable cases, and in the disordered cases, it has a completely different structure, non-smooth. So I'm not stopping in the details here. The interesting thing is that you really see convergence in the energy, in the system size. So system sizes there are up to 60, and you don't see any system size dependence anymore. There are other things that you can do with the filters that I'm just flashing here, because I want to spend a few minutes, 5 minutes or so, talking about a different thing, but I'm happy to talk about the other applications of the filters. So the final thing that I wanted to talk about is actually going to this picture, so really transforming the long-range entanglement into mixture. So there's this puzzle, like we go from the pure state description to the mixed one, and we would like to do this in a constructive way, so really ab initio method. So back to the quasi-particle picture, we get some intuition of how this might happen, or at least in some cases. In this quasi-particle picture, this is what I described before. You start in a state where you have these pairs of quasi-particles that are sort of localized, so there's no entanglement in your chain. But as time progresses, these things travel apart and then propagate your correlations in your system. So now imagine that you are only interested in local observables, which is what we typically have access to in experiments. So we just can divide our system in systems, say, the thing where we are measuring, and something on the left and something on the right. So we can write our state in quantum information, say, language as a tripartite state, where we have the system, the left, and the right. And in this particular situation, you can see that if you look at from the perspective of your system, you have some degrees of freedom that entangle, say, the environment, left and right, but are not entangled with your physical observables, because they do not stay in your system, they are completely out. There's entanglement. If you would cut your system in two, this would contribute to entanglement. This is what makes our MPS difficult to write. But it's not contributing to something that happens in your system. And from this quantum information language, we could write our state as a tensor product of something that, say, involves in principle everything and something that involves only the environments. This picture, this would be this red pair that would correspond in this case to this pair of quasi-particles here. So for local observables, what we will have is contribution, say, of one part of these pairs that are in our system, right? But not the other part. And the same if we put the observables on, say, our neighbors. So what this tells us is that these pairs that are sufficiently far away will only contribute to these local observables as a statistical mixture, because we will only see the effect of half of the pair and never the other. So the other can always be traced out. And we will never see the fact that they are correlated. So this is it. So how do we change that into an algorithm to follow the evolution? So our state, written as a density operator, will be this one. So we have in general this something that entangles left and right, and something that entangles with our system. And for the something that is entangled, like the green part here, that contains entanglement with the environment and the system, this is like the more generic part. I don't know what to do. So I don't want to do anything with that. I'm only concerned about transforming the long-range entanglement that I have identified. So what I'm saying is that because this thing will only contribute as mixture to local observables, I can either look at observables on the left, which will be affected by, say, tracing the right, so only from the marginal for the left part of my say, pair, or observables on the right will only be affected by the marginal for the right degree of freedom here. So basically what I can do is to cut the correlations in these long-range pairs and substitute them by a mixed state, which is a product of the marginals. So what I'm removing here are correlations, long-range correlations. And what remains is a product of marginals, which is a mixed state. So that's basically it. So what we did is to transform this in a tensor network algorithm by considering an infinite chain, which is translational invariant, and one tensor that represents several sides. So this tensor is our block. And for this tensor, we can find this kind of decomposition. This is 2. So we look for this kind of decomposition. I know I'm going very fast in here, so just look at the pictures. Don't worry about the details. I'm happy to describe the details. But the idea is what I told you. It's very simple. It's this intuition. So you have things that go very far away, and you have this quasi-particle picture. They are just flying away. They won't come back. So once they are far enough, if you are just worried about local observables, you don't care that it is correlated with something very far away. For you, it's the same as if it is a mixed state, which has the same reduced density matrix as this pair. So that's what we are doing. We are trying to identify these things that are far away enough, and then converting them into mixed in this way. So we identify these things in the tensor network. We check how good this decomposition is by, well, we would invert this decomposition and then check for the residual entropy between like the upper part and the lower part, and we will also check how much entanglement is carried by this thing that we identified. And I'm just showing the result. So what we found is in a free fermionic case, which is really the one that is closest to this picture, we see that if we try this decomposition, for in this case it's a blocks of 2 sides, we see that the entropy that is remaining between the upper, so slow part and fast part, is actually decaying exponentially with time. And it depends on the equations that we are doing, how fast it's decaying. But if we wait for long enough, it becomes smaller and smaller. So we are identifying something that really decouples from the physical degrees of freedom. And furthermore, it carries some entanglement, which is basically fixed. So once we identify this degree of freedom and it's getting decoupled, this is the negativity that is carried by this fast pair that we are sort of identifying. So it's really transporting this entanglement between the left and the right. And well, now, okay, we can do some further checks. We can construct a tensor network algorithm from that by identifying the transformation and transforming the state into a mixed state, just doing exactly what I said before. And now this is like a purification. So we didn't touch the physical degrees of freedom. We can continue evolving the physical degrees of freedom because they are still in the same basis and everything. And we can repeat the same operation again and again. So we can continue the evolution in this way. This is actually not enough doing it that way. We improve it with a heuristical algorithm, but let me show you the results in 2 minutes and then one. So this plot here is for the integral Wallising model, so really the free fermionic case where we expect the quasi-particle picture to be close to describing what's going on here. And what you're seeing here is a local observable, the magnetization. We are pointing from all the states polarized, all the systems, all the sites polarized in the x direction. So the magnetization originally is 1 in the x direction. And then we point to a different value of the magnetic field. So we know the exact solution. So the black line here is really the exact solution. The pink line is what the standard method, ITVD, would do with bond dimension up to 500. So it follows the evolution accurately enough, and then at time more or less 10, it deviates from this because you don't have enough bond dimension to keep on with the entropy. So if we do these transformations that I just described, you get this kind of orange line here, which is not so promising because you see it jumps, right, and it deviates and so on. It doesn't look so nice. But if you look closely, you see that it sort of captures the behavior of the two observables. So we are doing this separation, but it's not perfect. So what we did is a heuristic improvement, so taking this decomposition as initial step and running some optimization to improve the decomposition. And we got the blue line here that you basically cannot see, but you see a zoom here, which is really, really close to the true behavior for long times. And an important thing is that every time we do this decomposition, we reduce our bond dimension by 2. So our bond dimension is bounded by around 100 in here. The pink line in here, so this shows the bond dimension as a function of time. The pink line is the ITVD bond dimension, and of course when it saturates, we don't let it grow anymore, is when you start seeing the deviation, because it requires, more to keep track of the dynamics. So we also pushed it to some non-integral case to see that it also gives us some advantages, although it's not so nice. Yes?
Yeah, so let me understand this.
Yes.
So what you have in the inset is
This one?
No, the smaller one.
This one.
Yeah, this one. Okay.
It's a zoom of this region.
Yeah, it's a zoom of that region, and that is your TNR without the optimization, right?
There is both, but you almost cannot see it because the blue is so close to the green line, to the exact one. So the orange line is the one without the heuristic
Without the
optimization.
optimization.
Yeah, where we just find this decomposition
and then we are saying, oh, when we optimize it, basically we're kind of shifting somehow.
Yeah, we are
then
doing.
it coincides. And then you show that at a later time,
Exactly.
the same optimization still works. But
Yeah, exactly.
yeah, but I have a question about this second part.
Yes.
Where you say it works. So is it fair to say that it works, or somehow one might argue, oh, it's easy to make it work because this late time evolution, the exact one is typical anyway. So it's kind of flat. So you basically just fix.
But we are not fixing anything. That's the thing. We are not fixing anything.
No, yeah, because I don't know how your optimization works.
No, the
that's why
optimization
I'm asking.
I can tell you later because it's a bit technical. It's basically okay. What we are doing is if the composition of this fast and slow was exact, then this substitution would be perfect and it wouldn't make the local observables jump. And what you see is that if this is true, the reduced density matrix is where you trace out, say, so when you have this tripartite side, you either trace out the right side or you trace out the left. These are preserved. So this is what we are trying to do. That this thing is still preserved.
I see.
Yeah, so I can show you a bit more details later.
But
there's no-
just one thing.
Mhm.
So your optimization is not time dependent, right? So you do the, so only,
What do you mean?
so the optimization that you do for the first zoom is the same that you used to see on the
Yes, but
calculator
we do
or-
dynamics, so the tensors are different. So the optimization is always the same, the cost function is always the same one. But what we do is in between truncation
But the
steps,
cost
we
function is
evolve.
the same?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Yes. And it's only based on that, preserving the reduced density matrix when you trace out, say, the right or the left. Okay, so I can show you more details of the non-integrable case and so on, but I just have to stop, so I will just conclude here. So my message is that basically tensor networks can be used in other ways, so they can be very precise for the standard methods, but we can also think of other ways of using this very powerful technology to learn about dynamics in particular, which is hard. And I gave you some lines of work that we are following. I think this converting long-range entanglement is very interesting, and it should be further explored in more models, maybe in other situations, maybe with quantum information ideas, looking at other quantities that we should try to understand and in how, and because, I mean, what I learned from here is that if we understand how entanglement works in the dynamics, we can say more things, we can learn more about longer times. And tensor networks have the capability of capturing these dynamics for a certain time, and maybe it's enough to learn about this and give us some more effective models of entanglement or the interesting quantities. Anyway, so there are other things that one can do is to use the tensor networks themselves as tools to compute observables, and if we try to put in all the ingredients, then we gain in efficiency and we can go to longer times and get accurate quantities. And then finally, this full filter algorithms business gives us access to new quantities that we were not looking at before. And probably there are many other ways in which we can do these things. And this example of the off-diagonal ETH is a recent one, but I'm sure there are other things where this could be useful in general. So thank you very much for your attention.
So is there more questions? Yeah, Thomas.
I want to know for the eigenvector optimization hypothesis. Did you show, do you have results for the off-diagonal matrix elements? I mean, does it work or?
Yeah, I mean, it has some precision, of course, but for instance, I just showed this one here, which was like, I have more results that I didn't include the slides. For instance, so what we have access to is this kind of average. Okay, let me see. This kind of average. So we basically have access to well, it's an average of on this region, right? So if this thing is a picture of the matrix elements of the physical observable, then we are basically averaging over a region that looks like that. And then, of course, how many elements you have in here depends on the density of states. So we basically, assuming ETH, we get that what we are accessing is something like that. So we have access to this structure function as a function of the energy difference and the value of the energy for different observables weighted by this factor. So in this case, we use some trick to connect like the positive and negative energy differences and get rid of the factor, but basically this is what you expect. So you can access that function and okay. Yeah. So then the results were here. So this, for instance, was a comparison of at a certain finite energy density, what this function looks like for different system sizes and different systems. So it was this E-sync chain, that would be the free fermionic chain, where you would expect this thing to decay as e to the minus omega squared. And you see this behavior quite nicely. In the non-integrable case, you add, so we added next to nearest term, so like this ANI model, and then you see that the decay goes linearly, so e to the minus omega. And then in the disorder case, so with a large disorder, then you don't have this structure anymore, and you have, like, it's not smooth, so you don't go pretty much from here. But that would be an example. We have like the full map of this thing energy, and in principle, you could access more things. This was in collaboration with Raul, who was here last week, by the way.
More questions? Nothing.
I'm interested to know more about how you identify these long-range entangled modes to pull them out.
Okay, so you mean in practice in the tensor network
Yeah.
picture? It's actually pretty simple. So what we are doing is, okay, for simplicity, we say there's a translational invariant chain, let's block several sites in just one tensor. Principle one could generalize this and work more in the tensor network, but okay. One tensor contains several sites. We did it from 2 to 6 or something. And now we want to identify the decomposition that I described before. So we say in this quantum information picture is a tripartite state, and we want to find a decomposition of the left and right parts in left one, left two, right one, and right two, such that we identify this tensor product. We believe it is there, okay? And then we probe whether it is or not. If we find the right decomposition, we will go on. And okay, in the tensor network picture, these things are the bond dimensions, so we don't control the bases of that thing. We don't know which basis this is. So there can be an arbitrary change of bases in here. So we need to find some potentially different unitaries in there that hide the fact that our tensor has this structure. So what we are doing is actually minimizing this cost function. So this is a unitary, this is a unitary, and these are arbitrary vectors. And we do it by a typical alternating scheme, where we fix all the tensors one by one, and find the next one and iterate. And this is very efficient. And if this is a structure, it finds the solution. I cannot prove it mathematically, but in practice it's like that.
Is it meaningful to ask a question about how much population there is in this long piece as a function of time?
Indeed, what we do is similar to that, but in terms of entanglement, right? So what I showed, but I know it was very fast. Sorry about that. Was this one here? Let me see. Here, right? So this picture shows how much entanglement you have in there. So you have on the one hand how much entanglement you have left between the. So I have this picture, right? And this is not perfect, so I actually have something here in my actual decomposition, but I can now measure how much entanglement I have between this part and this part, and that will be precisely these curves as a function of time. But I can also try to measure how much entanglement this thing carries, like between left and right. What I do for that is I trace out all these things, and then I have a mixed state, so I look at negativity. And this is the entanglement negativity. So this number is the entanglement negativity for this thing. It's basically constant. Once I identify something, it's taking this entanglement. So it's really like I'm identifying a mode here, or a pair of modes. They have this entanglement, and they are getting disentangled from my physical. Yeah. I mean, I can show you more pictures.
Okay, cool. Very cool.
The extra leg in the middle?
Sorry?
Do you need the extra leg in the middle, the dotted line you drew?
Yes, that's the thing, that because the composition is not perfect. If it was perfect, that would be rank 1, and it would be perfect, and it wouldn't have these jumps that I was showing. But it is not perfect, so there is something there.
But is that maybe dependent on the physics that you're looking at?
Yes, indeed.
I mean, I guess for a quench, I can see that could be the case, but maybe there are other cases.
I don't know if there's some more to it, so
Yeah.
I'm sure there's more to understand in here, but yes, it certainly you see that how much entanglement you have left, which is really the entanglement entropy because of this Schmidt decomposition, depends on the quench. And it's harder, it's higher if you quench to the critical or on the other side of the transition. And this we understand because if you think of the initial state, and this is part, the modes that are populated, the diagonal modes that are populated at the beginning, so if you are on the same side, are fast modes somehow. So they, but in the other case, you have a lot of slow modes.
Michael?
Yeah, in that sense, the fast and slow, this has a lot of RG flavor to it,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I do wonder if, I mean, let's say you have a somewhat correlated wave function, which you could think of like doing time evolution or imaginary time evolution with the Ising model on like a mean field state that will have multiple powers of the Hamiltonian, so it will have connect a lot of sites. But if you ran an RG that would try to localize that again in that picture, I think, I mean, probably it would implement a disentangling, kind of like what you're describing, that you're separating the environment from the locally valid Hamiltonian. And yeah, again, it might be interesting to try something like that as an alternative to like a variational optimization like
I would be very interested to.
So in fact, I think there was like in summer, there was a paper by the Berlin group by Eisert where they applied, I mean, what I would call SRG, what they call continuous unitary transformations to actually extend the time evolution of, I think, of tensor networks with some tricks that they introduced. Again, it feels like it might be another take or a related take, or talking about trying to achieve something similar with maybe slightly differences in point of view.
Yeah,
So
so-
if we-
Mr. Question, so when we do the long time evolution, you know that we optimize the modes, as we already talked about it. So actually we generate the quasi-particles, and then as we do this sometimes we just optimize it, they push down the entanglement and so on. So could this be related to this picture, or how to rate it? Because we basically have the quasi-particle interaction, and that is this long and short range, but all this information is what then encoded into the basis. So but then we use the locality, and if I understood you correctly, then all these different manipulations, you still keep the locality of the.
Yeah, no,
Because
indeed.
When we go to this delocalized basis, of course, we can play with
Right.
this.
Mhm.
So I think it must be some one-to-one, some close connection.
Sort of agree. So the kind of change of bases we are doing happens only in the virtual degrees of freedom. So we are sort of identifying the long range in the virtual degrees of freedom, and then we are transforming this to mixer. But we never touch the physical degrees of freedom. That's why our whole evolution remains the same. But indeed, the virtual degrees of freedom are the rest of the system, right? So this is very non-local because it's really mapped to all the rest of the system on the right or on the left. So
Maybe we can take a look at this close to the what we are doing.
Yeah.
Maybe there is some.
yes, absolutely.
More questions?
I have a quick one. So in the beginning, you mentioned the tensor network is also good for thermal equilibrium properties. But I used to think thermal system does not have very long entanglement.
No, it does.
It does?
Not entanglement entropy, but mutual information. Actually, for any dimension, any spatial dimension, not only one.
I see.
So but for finite temperature. So the bound gets messed up if you go to zero temperature. But there is it's actually a simple demonstration.
I see.
Yeah, it's all orchestrated.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so your motivation at least relied on this quasi-particle picture. So I think I have two questions. So do you see qualitative differences if you go to non-trivial systems? And the second is, do you have ideas how to extend this to 2D? And you cannot say, okay, just the left and right.
Yes, very good question. So in the quasi-particle regime, so we see very similar behavior. Okay, so beyond the quasi-particle, what we did is we added the next to nearest term in the any model in this chain. So it's not that it works for any kind of breaking of integrability. In that case, what we found is that the decrease of entanglement entropy works similarly if it is not hugely large, the thing. And we see that we really capture the long time behavior too. We need to make this cut harder. So what we do in practice is we look at this decay of entropy, and only when it is small enough, we actually do the transformation. So we need, if we reduce this threshold and make it more and more demanding, then we get better results. The problem is that as we wait, we are doing exact evolution or quasi-exact evolution with the standard tensor network approach. So we need Larion one dimension, so there's this increase in one dimension. So we are sort of limited, but qualitatively, it seems to work quite nicely. But there's still much to explore, I would say. And in 2D, it's a great question. So I don't know. I would think of a quasi-particle situation where you could try to identify also things that disentangle in one direction or the other and start from there. But in a general situation, I don't know. I think it's a great question also from the point of view of trying to explore this in an experiment, right? You could think of what could you look at in an experiment to try to understand how environment dynamics goes. But yeah, very good question.
All right, so I think we should stop here. Thank you again, Marta.